It was 3 p.m. on Monday, February 21st, 1977, and Teresita Basa was feeling happy that her shift at North Chicago's Edgewater Hospital was over. She smiled and said goodbye to a couple of her coworkers as she closed her locker and shrugged into her winter coat. It was winter in Chicago, which meant the days were very cold and very short. That day, the sunset was barely after 5 p.m. But with her shift ending at 3 p.m., she'd be home by 4 p.m., which meant she'd still have a full hour of daylight before darkness fell over her adopted city. Already looking forward to that magical hour inside of her cozy 4-bedroom apartment, the slender 47-year-old woman from the Philippines made her way out onto the street and walked to the nearby elevated train station. A few minutes later, a train arrived and Teresita climbed on board. It wasn't rush hour, so there were plenty of seats to choose from. She found one she liked and she sat down right as the train began pulling out of the station. After putting her bag on the seat next to her, she turned around in her seat and put her fingertips against the window behind her. And even through her glove, she could feel how cold the glass was. Despite having lived in the United States for almost 15 years, there were times, especially in the winter, when she still felt surprised by how completely different Chicago was when compared to her hometown of Dumaguete, a city located 8,000 miles away on Negros Island in the southern Philippines. Here in Chicago, Teresita was surrounded by towering skyscrapers, and the average temperature in February hovered right around freezing. Back in Dumaguete, nicknamed the City of Gentle People, the temperature in February was hot, and the landscape was green and lush with lots of graceful Spanish-style architecture. But much as Teresita sometimes missed the Philippines and her family who still lived there, she was sure that if she had not come to the US, she never would have had a chance to achieve her dream. A dream that right now, Teresita felt was almost within her grasp. Much as she liked it, her current job as a respiratory therapist at the hospital was really just a means to an end, a way to pay her rent and to afford her beautiful piano that waited for her in her living room at home. She liked working with the patients, diagnosing and analyzing lung function, and then helping the doctors create treatment plans and prescribe interventions and medications. But this job was not why Teresita had left her home in the Philippines and come to America. She had come to America to pursue her lifelong passion, music. As a young child, Teresita begged her parents for piano lessons, and when they relented and let her have piano lessons, she was over the moon and played piano basically all the time. And when she wasn't playing the piano, she was marching around her home, humming along to the notes of the music in her head. Once Teresita had finished high school, she had been among the very small percent of women in her town at that time, it was the late 1940s, early 1950s, to go on to university in the Philippines' capital city of Manila. And after graduating from there, Teresita became part of an even smaller percentage of women who went on to get their master's degree. This time, Teresita would leave the Philippines to attend Indiana University in the United States. By the time she was enrolled at Indiana University, Teresita had decided that she would become a music teacher, not a concert pianist, which had been her original intended career path in music. Although when she got to Chicago, she would become a member of a very serious musical band called the Five Mahoganies Plus One that performed for large paying crowds. After getting her master's degree in Indiana, Teresita had moved north to Chicago, where she got her job at the hospital, and she enrolled at Chicago's Loyola University to get her doctorate in music. Her hope was that afterward, she would be hired by Loyola University and would become a professor of music, thereby fulfilling her dream. As the train she was on rattled down the tracks, inside her gloved hand pressing against the window, Teresita could feel the beautiful pearl cocktail ring her mother had given her the last time she had come to visit in Chicago. The ring had been a gift to Teresita's mother from Teresita's father, a wealthy judge, who had bought the jewelry for his wife while visiting France. Before returning to Dumaguete after that last visit, Teresita's mother had pressed the ring, along with a heavy jade pendant and a few other pieces of jewelry, into her daughter's hands, telling Teresita to wear them, and when she did, to think of her parents and how much they loved her. Teresita was an only child, and she knew full well just how much her mother and father had hoped she would return to the Philippines. Teresita understood that this gift of jewelry was her mother's way of telling her that her parents had finally accepted Teresita's decision to stay in the United States. Even though her mother's eyes had been filled with tears when she gave the jewelry to her daughter, Teresita knew how proud her parents were of her accomplishments and her determination to be self-sufficient and independent. As the train finally came to a stop at the station located just 4 blocks from her apartment building, Teresita grabbed her bag and then pulled her coat tight around her. She stood up and then headed out the train doors into the cold. By the time she reached her apartment building, Teresita had already planned out how she would spend her evening. She would practice piano, and then she would spend some time on her doctoral thesis and on the book she was writing about music composition and theory. She was also hoping to call a few people who might be interested in buying tickets to the next performance of her band, the 5 Mahoganies Plus One, and maybe she'd give her cousin a call too. Her cousin had actually also immigrated to the Chicago area from the Philippines, and so the two often chatted on the phone, enjoying a rare chance to speak in their native tongue, Tagalog. After getting off the elevator on the 15th floor, Teresita turned and began walking down the hallway toward her apartment, which was number 15B. Once she reached her door, she unlocked it with her key, she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. She took off her winter coat and hung it neatly in her closet. Then she took off her mother's pearl ring and carefully placed it next to her mother's jade necklace, which was on top of the dresser in her bedroom. After freshening up in the bathroom, Teresita went into her living room and she sat down at her beloved piano. As she ran her fingers across the keys, she looked out the nearby window and was happy to still see sunlight. With a smile on her face, she turned back to her piano, she closed her eyes, and she began to play. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m. that evening, Teresita heard a quiet knock on her front door. She set aside the work she had been doing on her doctoral thesis and walked toward the front of her apartment. When she reached the door, she called out, "Who's there?" When she got the answer, Teresita smiled, undid the lock and deadbolt, and then invited her guest inside. 1 hour later, at 9 p.m., the first fire engine screeched to a halt in front of Teresita's apartment building. The crowd of residents and curious bystanders gathered in front of the building scattered as firefighters jumped down from the truck and headed inside up the stairs to the 15th floor. 20 minutes earlier, the building's janitor had called 911 to report that residents had smelled and seen smoke coming out from under the door of apartment 15B. And sure enough, when firefighters arrived on the 15th floor, they saw thick curls of smoke pouring out from under that apartment door into the hallway. The janitor ran up and used his key to unlock 15B's door before turning and running back down the hall to the stairwell. With the door unlocked, the firefighters made entry. Inside apartment 15B, firefighters quickly saw and extinguished the source of the fire. It was a burning mattress on the floor of the bedroom, and near it was a pile of burning clothes. Once a thorough search revealed that the apartment was empty of any people, a fire department lieutenant used his boot to kick aside the smoldering pile of clothes, trying to see what might have caused the fire. Crowding in behind the lieutenant were a couple of uniformed police officers who had also arrived at the scene. And when those police officers and the lieutenant saw what was under those smoldering clothes, they instantly stepped back and turned their faces aside. Then, one of the police officers grabbed his radio and called for medical personnel, homicide detectives, and a crime scene unit. The first thing Chicago detective Joe Stachula and his partner Lee Eppen noticed when they stepped inside of Teresita's apartment was the mess. Looking into the kitchen, they could see drawers had been pulled out and cupboards were open, and in the living room, lamps had been knocked over and a coffee table overturned. But even though they were preparing for something much worse when they stepped into Teresita's bedroom, what they actually saw still stunned them. In front of them, lying on her back on the floor next to the bed, was the body of a woman. The fire had burned most of the dark wavy hair from her head, along with most of the skin on the right side of her face. She was naked, her knees were spread wide apart, but her feet were almost touching each other. Her arms were out to either side, bent upwards at the elbows, so her hands were near her head. And in the very center of her chest was a large kitchen knife, buried into her torso right up to the wooden hilt. It did not take detectives long to confirm that the body in 15B was that of Teresita Basa. And based on the condition of her body and the disorder inside of her apartment, it also didn't take investigators long to come up with a working theory of what happened to her. Since the door to her apartment was not deadbolted from the inside, police assumed that Teresita had opened the door for her killer. and once the killer, who they believed was male, was inside, he overpowered Teresita, he sexually assaulted her, and then he murdered her. After she was dead, he ransacked her apartment looking for valuables, and then before leaving, he tried to burn her body to destroy any incriminating evidence. But when the autopsy report came back a few days later, this working theory fell apart. According to the medical examiner, not only was there no evidence of sexual assault, it turned out that Teresita was actually a virgin. So, with this new information, the police now knew that Teresita's body had been staged to look like a sexual assault had taken place. The killer, who they now knew could easily have been a man or a woman, likely was just trying to confuse police. As for the robbery angle, the police had no way of knowing if anything was actually taken from apartment 15B because Teresita lived there alone, and so only Teresita would have known if something was missing. And while the fire had been relatively small and mostly contained to just Teresita's bedroom, it had been big enough that it completely destroyed any evidence of fingerprints on the murder weapon. Additionally, interviews with Teresita's neighbors, co-workers, family, friends, university professors, supervisors, and possible love interests all led to one dead end after another. While Teresita occasionally entertained male visitors and went out on a few dates, there did not appear to be any serious boyfriends in her life. 10 years earlier, Teresita had fallen in love with a man from Chicago, but on a trip home to the Philippines to meet her family, the man had turned up drunk and naked in the city's red light district with a teenage girl on his lap. Ever since then, Teresita had become much more interested in friendship than in romance. As a result, there was no sign of some of the more obvious murder motives like jealousy, affairs, marital problems, or sexual entanglements. And when it came to identifying possible suspects at Edgewood Medical Center, the hospital itself was so big, with hundreds of employees working various schedules in dozens of different departments, and hundreds more visitors and visiting medical personnel, that detectives had to narrow their interviews to just co-workers whose shifts and responsibilities overlapped with Teresita's. And the verdict among that small group was unanimous. Everybody loved Teresita. She was kind, she was quiet but friendly, she was great with her patients, she was good at her job, she was reliable, punctual, hardworking, and at lunch in the cafeteria, she liked to eat alone, always sitting in the same place, humming bars of music in between bites of her food. Teresita's neighbors on the 15th floor of her apartment building didn't have anything to add either. They said Teresita did periodically have guests at her apartment, but on the night of her murder, no one on the floor had seen anyone enter or leave Teresita's apartment. By the end of April, 6 weeks after Teresita's murder, detectives Stachula and Eppen had gotten virtually nowhere on the case. However, they did have two viable leads. The first lead had to do with a phone call Teresita received on the night of her murder. Teresita's friend, Ruth Loeb, called her around 7:30 p.m., and the two women chatted for about 20 minutes. Ruth would tell the detectives that on this call, Teresita mentioned that she was going to have a visitor over that night, and Ruth would recall actually hearing a man's voice in the background of Teresita's apartment toward the end of their phone call. However, Teresita didn't say who this male visitor was, and Ruth didn't recognize the voice. 1 hour after Ruth and Teresita hung up their phones, authorities would discover Teresita's body. This meant Teresita had been killed right after her call with Ruth. This also meant that Teresita's unknown male visitor that night had most likely been her killer. The second lead detectives had was a cryptic note that Teresita had written in her personal diary. It just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." But to that point, police had not come across anyone or heard of any friend or acquaintance of Teresita's with the initials A.S., so they had no idea who this A.S. person was. But despite these promising leads, detectives continued to hit dead end after dead end in their investigation. And so by the summer of 1977, Teresita's murder seemed destined to go unsolved. However, that would not be the case, because something incredibly unusual and downright disturbing was about to happen that would lead the detectives to the killer. Not long after Teresita's murder, one of the other respiratory therapists at Edgewater Hospital began to act very strangely. Her name was Remy Chua, she was 38 years old, and like Teresita, she was from the Philippines. Remy didn't work the same shift as Teresita, and so she had very little interaction with her and didn't know her well. But, according to Remy's co-workers, following Teresita's death, Remy began using Teresita's locker at work, and she also began to sit in the exact same seat in the cafeteria that Teresita would always sit at. Remy even began to hum as she sat there alone and ate her lunch, just like Teresita had. Remy also began to talk at length about a brand new interest she had, music. Unsettled by what they considered to be Remy's obvious impersonation of a murdered colleague, Remy's co-workers eventually asked her why she was doing what she was doing. But Remy just looked at them confused and then waved them off dismissively and said she was not acting like Teresita, she was acting like herself. Eventually, when Remy's behavior didn't stop, a few of her co-workers complained to their supervisor. And when the supervisor approached Remy and told her about her co-workers' complaints, Remy became furious and aggressive. And in fact, her outburst got so out of hand that the supervisor wound up firing her. When Remy arrived home that day, she was still very upset. Her husband, Dr. Jose Chua, who was a surgeon in Chicago, not at Edgewater but at another hospital, instantly noticed that his wife looked distraught. So he asked her to come sit down with him and tell him what was wrong. So Remy walked into the living room, she sat down in a chair, and then she began to tell her husband a sort of distorted version of what had happened. She told her husband not that she was just fired, but rather that her job had just been canceled, and so now she was out of work. Remy didn't mention anything about her mimicry of Teresita Basa and how that had actually led to her job loss. Now, at this point in the story, you need to understand that Dr. Chua had no idea that there were any strange things happening with his wife. She seemed totally normal to him up until she had come home upset. Also, at this point, Dr. Chua had never heard the name Teresita Basa before. He had no idea who she was, or that she had worked with his wife at the hospital, or that she had recently been killed. So, when Dr. Chua's wife suddenly stood up from her chair in the living room mid-sentence and just said kind of robotically that she was going to go lie down for a while, Dr. Chua had no idea that he and his wife were about to get drawn into one of the most bizarre and unlikely murder investigations in American history. After Remy stood up and left for her bedroom, her mother, who was visiting the couple, would say that the look on her daughter's face was so strange that she turned and asked Dr. Chua to follow her and make sure his wife was okay. Dr. Chua did just that, and he arrived in the bedroom to find his wife lying on top of the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Startled by the fixed look on his wife's face, Dr. Chua sat down next to her on the edge of the bed and asked her, "Is anything wrong?" But the voice that answered him did not belong to his wife. It was instead a voice he had never heard before. It spoke in the native Philippine language of Tagalog, which he and his wife both knew but rarely used, and the voice spoke with a distinct Spanish accent that he had never heard his wife use before. "Doctor," the voice coming out of his wife's mouth said, "you must help me." Dr. Chua was so caught off guard by this alien-sounding voice that he immediately defaulted to his medical training. He decided he needed to check to see if his wife was actually coherent or not, so he asked her a simple question: "What is your name?" But instead of his wife saying Remy in her normal voice, she said, still speaking in Tagalog with a Spanish accent, "I am Teresita Basa." Dr. Chua felt chills go all over his body. Then, after a pause, he said that he didn't know anyone by that name. When his wife just lay there motionless, still staring up at the ceiling, Dr. Chua broke the silence and said, "Well, what do you want?" The voice responded immediately. She said she had been murdered and she wanted to tell the doctor the name of her killer. Dr. Chua was at a complete loss. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he was experiencing. And so he just started stroking his wife's arm and telling her that everything was okay and to relax and that she needed to wake up now and come back to him. But as he tried to kind of calm his wife down, the voice coming out of her mouth only became more insistent. It told Dr. Chua the first and last name of her killer. Then the voice gave very specific details of her own murder. The voice said that her killer had arrived alone at her apartment around 8 p.m. on the night of Monday, February 21st, and that she, Teresita, had let him in because he was a friend. But this friend, once inside of her apartment, had stabbed Teresita and killed her. In all, Remy's apparent trance lasted for about 30 minutes. When she came to, she began glancing around the room wildly when she saw her husband sitting on the bed next to her looking gravely concerned, and her mother standing in the corner looking horrified. Remy asked, "What's going on?" Dr. Chua gently asked his wife if she remembered anything that had just happened. Puzzled, Remy shook her head no and said that the last thing she remembered was sitting in the chair in the living room, and that she had no idea how she got to this bedroom. Dr. Chua, who was very rattled by what he had just experienced, took a deep breath and then tried to explain to his wife everything that had just happened in that bedroom. When Dr. Chua asked Remy if she knew this woman, Teresita Basa, Remy, who was now visibly shaking, told her husband that she did. Teresita was a woman she worked with at the hospital and that she had just been killed. But Remy said she barely knew her, they were just acquaintances. However, as she told her husband this, Remy suddenly remembered something that happened to her 2 weeks earlier that she had tried to forget about, but now she couldn't help but bring it up. Remy said 2 weeks earlier, she had gone into the break room at the hospital after a long shift to take a nap, and just seconds after closing her eyes, she felt a presence in the room with her. Thinking one of her coworkers must have silently stepped into the room, she was horrified when she opened her eyes, and there, standing right in front of her, staring down at her, was the recently murdered Teresita Basa. Remy was so instantly terrified that without making a sound, she just leapt to her feet and ran out of the room and down the hallway. After a few seconds, she stopped running and she turned around, but Teresita wasn't there anymore. With her heart still pounding, Remy told herself that she must have just imagined seeing Teresita, that was all just a dream. But she couldn't shake the image of Teresita standing there staring at her. It felt so real. Terrified and embarrassed, she had decided not to tell anyone about seeing the ghost of Teresita until now. After hearing the story, Dr. Chua told his wife that, of course, that must have just been a dream. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that's nothing. But deep down, he was frightened too, and couldn't understand how that could have happened just 2 weeks ago, and now they're in this bedroom dealing with this trance scenario that involves Teresita. Shifting the conversation back to reality, Dr. Chua asked his wife if she recognized the name of Teresita's killer. The voice had repeated the name several times, and Remy would say yes, she did know who that person was. But ultimately, the Chuas decided that they could not possibly go to the police with any of this information. How could they explain to police how they got it? They'd look foolish or crazy or even suspicious. So the couple just kind of went on with their day and acted like Remy's trance had never happened. Then, that night, Remy got a telephone call. Dr. Chua, who was standing nearby when his wife answered, could hear a man's voice on the other end of the line. His wife only managed to say a few words before hanging up the receiver, but when she turned back to her husband, her face was pale. She told him that it was someone from work whose voice she didn't recognize, but the man had just threatened her and told her that he was, quote, going to get her next. Again, out of fear, the Chuas decided not to go to police. 2 days later, while Remy was on the phone talking to a real estate agent standing near where her husband was sitting, Remy suddenly dropped the telephone receiver and stood awkwardly still and went into another trance. Again, the voice that came out of Remy's mouth was not her own. It was the voice that claimed to be Teresita. And this time, the voice was even more insistent. "You must help me, doctor," she pleaded. "You are the only one who can help find my killer. You must go to the police with everything I've told you." The voice went on to tell Dr. Chua not to be afraid, that he would not get in trouble for coming forward with this information, that Teresita would protect him and his family. However, once Remy snapped out of this second trance, the Chuas, again, did not go to the police. Even though they were starting to believe that these trances might actually be real, that Teresita really was communicating with them from beyond the grave, they felt like they didn't have any real evidence to back up what this voice was claiming, and so they still just could not go to police. No one would believe them. A few days later, Remy would fall into yet another trance. While Remy and her husband were asleep in bed, Remy suddenly opened her eyes and, while remaining stiff as a board on her back, she began speaking to Dr. Chua in the now familiar Tagalog with the Spanish inflection. When Dr. Chua woke up and saw what was happening right next to him, he was ready. He demanded that the voice provide real proof that could confirm her claim about the killer's identity, and the voice would do just that. According to the voice, after Teresita had let her killer inside of her apartment, the killer had knocked her unconscious, and after stabbing her, he had rifled through her apartment and taken several pieces of jewelry that had been given to her by her mother. Her killer had disposed of some of the pieces, but he had kept a jade and gold necklace and a pearl cocktail ring that he had given to his longtime girlfriend with whom he lived. Not only did the voice describe every detail of the ring and the necklace, but also the voice told Dr. Chua the names and the phone numbers of Teresita's relatives who lived in the Chicago area who could actually identify this jewelry as belonging to Teresita. The voice ended the trance by telling Dr. Chua that once police found this jewelry, they would find the killer. After this third visitation from what appeared to be the spirit of Teresita, Dr. Chua and Remy felt like they had to share this information with authorities. But the Chuas were still nervous about going public with their story, so instead of contacting the Chicago police, they contacted their own local police department in Evanston, Illinois, which was north of Chicago. And instead of saying that they had got all this information from the voice of a dead woman, they told the police that Remy had received that threatening phone call from a former co-worker at Edgewater Hospital, and they identified this co-worker using the name of the man that the voice, Teresita, had said was her murderer. The Chuas then surprised the Evanston police by suggesting that this threatening phone call could be related to the murder of Teresita Basa. It should be noted that we don't know if Remy and Dr. Chua concocted this story in order to more discreetly tell police what they had learned from the voice, or if they actually came to believe that the person who called Remy and threatened her was the same person who the voice identified as the killer. So, in early August 1977, 5 months after Teresita's death, Chicago detective Joe Stachula was notified by Evanston police about a possible tip in the Teresita murder case. A few days later, when Detective Stachula followed up directly with the Evanston police for more details on this tip, the Evanston police officer told Stachula the name the Chuas had given them of the man who had apparently made this harassing phone call and who the Chuas thought was connected to the murder of Teresita Basa. And when Detective Stachula heard this person's name, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight. A few days after that, Detective Stachula found himself sitting in the Chua's living room, staring at a highly educated and articulate couple who seemed incredibly reluctant to elaborate in any way on the tip they had called in to the Evanston police station. After a brief description from Remy about the threatening call she had received almost 3 weeks earlier, Detective Stachula could no longer ignore Dr. Chua's obvious distress as the doctor sat there shifting in his seat and wringing his hands while his wife was speaking. When Detective Stachula turned towards the doctor and asked him point blank, "Is there something about this murder investigation that you want to tell me?" Dr. Chua looked extremely embarrassed, but instead of answering the detective's question, the surgeon leaned forward and looked intently at the detective's face before asking a question of his own. "Do you believe in the occult or in possession and exorcism?" Detective Stachula worded his answer carefully, telling Dr. Chua that as a homicide investigator, he always tried to keep an open mind and follow up on any information that could help solve a murder case. Dr. Chua nodded silently, then took a deep breath, and he told the detective the whole story of how, starting back in mid-July, the spirit of Teresita Basa had begun temporarily possessing his wife's body. And during these possessions, Teresita would give them very specific information, like about the exact type of jewelry that was taken from her apartment, that Teresita insisted would help police catch her killer, a man named Alan Showery. When Detective Stachula had first heard the Evanston police officer say this name, Alan Showery, it had caused the hairs on his neck to stand up because Alan's initials were A.S., just like the initials written in that cryptic note Teresita had left in her personal diary before she was killed. The note had just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." When Detective Stachula asked the couple if they knew anything about this Alan Showery person, Remy said Alan was a 31-year-old respiratory technician at Edgewater Hospital and he was friends with Teresita. However, it would turn out he was one of the employees at the hospital who was not originally interviewed by police because his shifts did not overlap with Teresita's. While the information that Dr. Chua and Remy had just told him sounded very promising, the fact that it was apparently delivered by the murder victim herself after she was dead seemed so unbelievable to Detective Stachula that instead of writing up a formal police report about his interview with the Chuas, he instead just described the interview in a confidential memo that he sent only to his commanding officer. Following the Chua interview, police would rule out Remy and her husband, Dr. Chua, as suspects in Teresita's murder because both of them had rock-solid alibis. The police would also run a background check on Alan Showery, and it would show that he had a lengthy rap sheet, which included being arrested for, but not convicted of, theft, burglary, and rape. Through new interviews with Teresita's co-workers, police confirmed that Alan and Teresita were friends and that on the night of her murder, Alan may have gone to Teresita's apartment to fix her broken TV set, because apparently someone had overheard him say that. And if that was true, that would place him right at the scene of the crime. So, on the afternoon of August 11th, 1977, almost 6 months after Teresita was killed, Detectives Stachula and Eppin arrived at the apartment of Alan and his girlfriend Yanka and asked to speak with Alan down at the police station about Teresita's murder. While Alan immediately agreed to the request and chatted to detectives on the ride to the station about what a wonderful person and good friend Teresita had been, he also insisted to police that the last time he had seen Teresita was 6 months before her death. But when investigators bluffed, telling him they'd found his fingerprints at Teresita's apartment, Alan reconsidered, saying that on second thought, he had been at Teresita's apartment on the night of her murder to fix her TV, but that he had left at 6:30 p.m. because he didn't have the right tools with him to fix the TV. At that point, police went back to Alan's apartment to see if Yanka could confirm her husband's alibi. But it wasn't what Yanka had to say that grabbed officers' attention. It was what she was wearing. There, on one of her fingers, officers saw a large, distinctive pearl cocktail ring. It was exactly like the one that the Chuas said belonged to Teresita and had been taken from her apartment by the killer. When investigators asked Yanka where she had gotten the ring, she told them it was a late Christmas present, along with some other pieces of jewelry that Alan had given her in late February, which would have been right around the time that Teresita was murdered. Detectives immediately asked Yanka to join her husband at the police station and to bring her jewelry collection with her. Yanka agreed, and then police, using the list of names and phone numbers that Dr. Chua had given them, contacted some of Teresita's relatives who lived in the area, and they came to the police station as well. And those relatives, including Teresita's cousin, immediately identified the ring Yanka was wearing and the jade pendant in her jewelry box as the jewelry that Teresita's father had bought in France for Teresita's mother, and that Teresita's mother had then given the jewelry to Teresita during her last visit to Chicago. When police confronted Alan with the ring, along with the information provided by Teresita's relatives, Alan abandoned his claim that he was innocent of any involvement in Teresita's murder, and by early the next morning, on August 12, 1977, police had a 13-page signed confession from Alan. According to that confession and additional interviews from Teresita's co-workers, this is what happened to Teresita on the night of her murder. Alan arrived at Teresita's apartment at about 6:30 p.m. to fix her TV. But after realizing he did not have the right tools to fix it, he told Teresita that he would just have to come back another time, and he left her apartment shortly after 7:30 p.m. to walk back to his own apartment, which was only a block away. On that walk home, Alan did a lot of thinking. He had some serious money problems. He was currently behind on rent, and if he couldn't get his hands on a lot of cash very soon, his landlord was going to evict him and Yanka, who was several months pregnant. And when Alan wondered where and how he could come up with that kind of money, he thought of Teresita. He knew she came from a wealthy family in the Philippines, and it seemed to him that she must have a lot of cash on hand. So when Yanka went out shopping at about 8 p.m. that night, Alan decided to go back to Teresita's and rob her. When Teresita heard that knock on her front door at about 8 p.m., she was sitting at her table, busy working on her doctoral thesis. When she heard Alan's voice on the other side of the door, saying he'd come back with the right repair tools, she quickly undid the deadbolt to welcome him inside. As she turned back to close the door behind him, Alan lunged at Teresita, using his arm to encircle her neck from behind in a vicious chokehold as he dragged her into her bedroom. He continued to squeeze her neck until she was unconscious. Then, Alan lay Teresita down on the bedroom floor on her back, he stripped off all of her clothes, and arranged her body to look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he walked into the kitchen, and he grabbed a large knife that was laying on a cutting board nearby. He walked back into the bedroom with the knife in hand, and he stood over Teresita, who was still on the ground unconscious, and then he raised the knife into the air, and then drove it straight down into the center of her chest. After pausing to catch his breath and to make sure that Teresita was dead, Alan got back onto his feet and began searching the apartment for the small fortune in cash that he was sure he would find. In the end, though, after pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, and turning over small pieces of furniture, all Alan would find was just $30. Glancing at his watch, Alan knew Yanka would be back soon, and he needed to hurry. So he stepped to Teresita's bed, he pulled the mattress down on top of her to hide her body, and then he piled her clothes up on top of and next to the mattress and set it all on fire. On his way out of her bedroom, he gathered up the jewelry that he found on top of her bedroom dresser and inside her small jewelry box. Then he let himself out the front door and slipped down the hallway to the elevator and then back out to the street where he breathed in fresh, cold winter air. In his confession, Alan was convinced that Teresita never felt a thing after she lost consciousness, meaning she did not feel the knife being plunged into her chest that killed her. However, we have no way of knowing if that's actually true. 17 months after Teresita's murder, on Friday, January 27, 1979, the judge overseeing the Alan Showery murder trial declared a mistrial when the jury of 8 men and 4 women reported that they were hopelessly deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous verdict of either guilty or not guilty. The trial itself, dubbed the Voice from the Grave trial, had been an 8-day-long national media sensation, with Alan's defense team calling into question any charge that was based on information delivered to police by Teresita's ghost. The prosecution argued that the source of the information that police got from the Chuas was immaterial. The only thing that mattered was whether the information was accurate. And even though Alan would later recant both his oral and written confessions, police said that the hard evidence they had collected proved that he was, in fact, Teresita's killer. Alan's lawyers were ecstatic when the judge declared a mistrial. They had poked so many holes in the Voice from the Dead story that they told Alan that he was sure to get a not guilty verdict in his new trial. They had also proved that Remy was an unreliable witness, that she had, in fact, known Teresita much better than she had originally told detectives, maybe even well enough to know details about what jewelry Teresita owned and the names of Teresita's relatives. But 3 weeks later, on February 22nd, 1979, almost 2 years to the day that Teresita was killed, Alan Showery surprised the world by changing his story yet again. This time, against the advice of his legal team, Alan changed his plea to guilty in the murder of Teresita Basa. Alan Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the minimum mandatory sentence for murder. But just 4.5 years into Alan's sentence, he was released from prison on parole for good behavior. His whereabouts today are unknown. 45 years later, the case of Teresita Basa's murder remains one of the strangest investigations in police history. But whether or not you believe the story Dr. Jose Chua and his wife Remy told Chicago police, the fact remains that the information they provided to investigators turned out to be the key to finding and convicting the man who eventually confessed to being Teresita's killer. Also, as a final piece of information to think about, buried in the interview notes amongst the dozens and dozens of interviews police conducted with Edgewater Hospital employees, there are 3 different accounts from employees who all claim the same thing, that they came face to face with an apparition that looked like Teresita, who pleaded with them to help bring her killer to justice. In 1971, a 19-year-old Irishman named William began studying physics and computer science at a university in Belfast, Northern Ireland. While he was certainly smart enough to complete the 4-year degree, after 1 year of being in the school, he decided to drop out because he felt like this was not the path he wanted to be on. So he moved back home to a town about 30 minutes north of Belfast, where he got a job as a forklift driver and truck driver for the Guinness Beer Factory. And while he loved this job, he still felt like this was not the path for him. He needed to do something more with his life. And so he decided he would pursue what 2 of his siblings had gone on to do, which was to become a school teacher. He had always admired his school teachers growing up, and he idolized his 2 siblings that had become teachers, and so it felt like the right fit. And so William applied to a 4-year teaching college in Newcastle in England, and after he was accepted, he flew to England, he got set up, and then he began his studies. The first year was great. He loved what he was doing, he did feel like this is the right fit, and he was getting good grades, everything was going exactly to plan. But then year 2 happened and everything went off the rails. A requirement to graduate from this 4-year teaching college was all the aspiring teachers starting in their 2nd year had to go teach real students real lessons. They basically had to go to high schools and elementary schools and fill in for the real teacher and give a real lesson. And they were scored on their ability to do that. But all the aspiring teachers knew that when you gave these real lessons to real students, what really ended up happening was the students did not take the aspiring teachers seriously. They viewed them as kind of like substitute teachers, and so they didn't respect them and they didn't listen to them. And so typically these real teaching sessions just turned into the aspiring teachers desperately trying to calm down their pupils long enough to get them to listen to their lesson plan for just 1 second. But normally it didn't work out, and before long the day was over and nothing was really accomplished. So in William's 2nd year, when it was his turn to go over to a high school and administer his lesson plan, he went over there knowing what he was up against. He did not really expect it to go well, but he decided he would go in there with a positive attitude and he would try to do his best. But as soon as he walked into his classroom, he immediately could tell he was going to be overwhelmed. Everybody's standing up and talking amongst themselves, and they turn around and they see William walking in, and they have this moment of realization that their real teacher is not going to be teaching them that day. It's going to be this substitute, William, and they all kind of gleefully began laughing and joking, and they just turned their backs on William and kept talking amongst themselves. And so William goes inside, he puts his stuff on the desk, and he attempts to get the class to listen to him by saying, "Hey everyone, come on, sit down, time to listen up, I'm your new teacher for the day." But the kids just were not listening. And so finally, William, who was a really big guy, he was 6'4", he was in great shape, he kind of postured himself and then yelled at the class, "Sit down right now." And at this, the class did turn around and looked at William and kind of sized him up, and most of them decided, okay, it's time to sit down. And so 99% of the class goes quiet and sits down, except for one kid. It was this 15-year-old boy who was at the back of the room, and he was standing up, defiant, with his arms crossed, staring at William with a smirk on his face. And all around him, all his cronies were sitting down, looking up at him, laughing, and kind of looking up at William and laughing at him, knowing that a confrontation was about to ensue. And so William is staring at this kid, trying to get him to just sit without saying anything, and this kid is just mean mugging him with his arms crossed, and nothing's happening. And so William walks right up to him and kind of leans over his shoulder and says, "You need to go out in the hallway right now. I will meet you out there." And then William turned around and started walking back towards the front of the room, expecting this to have worked, that this 15-year-old kid would have just followed right along and he'd walk right out to the hallway and that would be that. But when he turned back around again, the 15-year-old kid had not moved. He was still standing in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, staring up at William, basically saying, "Make me." And at this, William lost his mind. He was so mad and so frustrated at how unbelievably disrespectful this kid was being, and really the whole class was being to him, that he just kind of lost it. And he ran up to this kid in the back of the room and he gets right up in his face. And remember, William is 6'4". He's a big guy. And he gets right in the kid's face and he's like, "Get out in the hall right now." And this kid doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a knife, and he holds it right up against William. And William, without any hesitation, just winds up and blasts this kid across the side of the head, sending him flying over a kid sitting at a desk. He goes flying over this kid and crumples into the corner. And then when he stands up, he drops the knife and puts his hands up, and he's like, okay, I'll go out in the hall. And William's like, go out in the hall right now. And so the kid ran out of the classroom. He goes out into the hall, and the whole class is totally silent. No one even wants to look up at William. They're all kind of just looking down at their desk, trying to be as quiet as possible. And William walks back to the front of the class and proceeds to teach the rest of the lesson. As soon as the high school learned that this aspiring teacher, William, had basically knocked out one of their students, even though it seemed like it might have been a little bit deserved, they immediately told the teacher's college, and the teacher's college immediately expelled William. And so now William is suddenly jobless, and he's kind of lost again in the world. He doesn't know what he wants to do now because he really had committed to being a teacher. And so he goes back to his home in Northern Ireland, and he begins thinking about, what is he going to do next? And he keeps having this thought that he should pursue this thing that he's always been interested in, but he had never taken seriously because it felt so risky. But now that basically everything in his life had fallen apart, he had nothing to lose. So he decided, what the heck, I will do the thing that I've always wanted to do. And that was stage acting. And so he went and auditioned with a local theater company in Belfast. He was accepted into the theater troupe. And then 4 years later, he was discovered performing on stage by a Hollywood filmmaker. And they cast him in a movie. And the rest, as they say, is history. William Neeson, better known as Liam Neeson, would go on to star in dozens of huge movies and TV shows. And he's probably best known for his epic role in the movie Taken, where he is this CIA operative with a particular set of skills, and in this movie, he punches a lot of people in the face, just like when he was a teacher. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what? The next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors. And as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car. He pulls out this brown Adidas bag. He throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot. He parks nearby, and then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around, and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag, and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal, and Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker, and he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything. He takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room. He uses the key. He opens up the lock. He opens the locker up. He checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench. They see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer. You're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around, but in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what? Why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting, something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program. He signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing. And right away, they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest, and when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie. And so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the new talent program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this new talent program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. And so the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away as he's carrying those groceries that guy, he's going to be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. You're not going to be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar new talent program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, "Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented." By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job, despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job, literally holding a book, teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like, put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity, I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses, and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. At the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition, but I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help. And so this director tells Fred, okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it. And so finally, Harry says, okay, fine, I'll go do this thing. And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines. And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself, he was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo. And so Harrison Ford said, all right, I'll play Han Solo. And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with the silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, I missed my bet. And he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the new talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, you're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired. It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere, as he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card, chucked it, and went back to eating his lunch. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section.